Hello everybody, welcome back. I hope you had, first of all, a very stimulating morning and equally restful and productive lunch. And we are here today with Cristina, Uba Cristina Ali Farah, and she is the second author of today, and I have the pleasure and honor to interview her. I would like to just say that Cristina was born in Verona in 1973, and she was raised in Mogadishu, Somalia. Left Mogadishu in 1991 and returned to Europe. And then in a very circuitous way ended up again in Italy and in Rome, where she lived for a while. And now she lives in Brussels since 2013. Well, I met Cristina in 2013 in Lampedusa, so that was for me, a very powerful experience. And the pleasure also of meeting Cristina was additional to the strong experience and the emotion that captured me when I arrived and landed in Lampedusa. But without much ado, I would like to say that Cristina encompasses many subjectivities, many identities, Italian, Somali, African, European. So I would like to know how you, if I will just talk to her as a you person, how you have elaborated this multiple subjectivity in your work.
Thank you, Simona. First of all, I wanted also to thank Lydia for inviting me. It's really an honor, and I'm very happy to be here, very glad to be here. We were talking with Simona about how we met in Lampedusa, and for me it was a very important moment because I was leaving Italy at that moment, and I was going to live in Belgium, and I didn't know, I didn't speak French at the time, so somehow it was a very strong experience for me to be displaced again. And as you said, I was born in Verona. My mother and my father were both students when I was born, and yes, they met there. And often people ask me why you have two names. And my mother at the time was 20. She didn't speak Somali at all. She didn't know anything about Somalia. And so she just decided to call me Cristina. And Cristina is not only unpronounceable in Somali, but it is also a name that it's related with religion. So my grandmother immediately decided to change my name, to give me another name. And she said, okay, you from now on your name will be Ubah. And I didn't use Ubah for many years after I left Somalia because nobody knew that I had also this name. And what happened was that I remember, so it was 1991 when the Civil War started. And first I moved to Hungary because my mother had a job in Hungary and she was teaching there. And then I went back to, I say I went back, but actually, yeah, I lived in Verona only for the first 2 years of my life. And I went back to Verona, and I was convinced somehow that I belonged to that city because it was my mother's city. But the 90s were very difficult. It was a very difficult political situation in Italy. It was the beginning of, it was the moment where Italians realized immediately that they were not only migrants, but that people were coming to Italy. So when I would, sometimes when I lived in Somalia, I would visit my grandmother sometimes, and I was welcomed. I didn't feel any racism, anything. At least I didn't feel it. But then when in the 90s it was a completely different situation. Also because I was a young refugee, even though I was not a refugee, but I felt as a refugee. I mean, I was a refugee, but I had the Italian documents, so I didn't have this kind of. I was a very young mother, and in Somalia, perhaps there were many young women who were mothers, but in Italy was something that was completely not common. And as I always say, when I was in Somalia, I grew up in a household where my mother would speak in Italian, but the language of the everyday life was Somali. But at the same time, I attended some Italian school, so the language of my formal education was Italian, yes, and I would write every day. I had a sort of a journal. I would write this journal every day about in Somalia, but writing it in Italian. Yes, and suddenly after the civil war, I was not able to write anything, and it was like an obsession for me. I loved writing, and I think that it was also a practice to I don't know, that helped me afterwards to write. I was not able to write at all until I remember a journey I went to visit my father, who was living in Utrecht at the time, a small city near Utrecht. Actually, it was Zeist, and I was very. It has been a long time since I met my father. And so I was preparing myself in the morning, and I'm short-sighted at the time. I was wearing monthly lenses, annual lenses, and I tried to put my lenses on, and one of them fall on the floor, and I wasn't able. I didn't have a lot of time. I wasn't able to find it. And so I decided I could put off both of them and just wear my glasses. But because my father and my relatives didn't see me, haven't seen me for such a long time, I didn't want to present myself with glasses. I was like, oh no, it was a little bit of vanity. And so I arrived, and everybody was waiting for me, my cousins and so on. And so this first impact with the diaspora was like divided in two parts. From one part I could see everything very clearly, and the other part was my gaze was how can I say confused, obfuscated, and for people who know what sharp-sightedness is, you feel like you cannot see perfectly the details, but at the same time you have also the feeling that the other people cannot see you, and so you are like in a shell, like protected by this kind of shell. And after that visit to Zeist, I started writing again. Somehow the diaspora gave me the fuel, how can I say, to start talking again about this experience, because I didn't have the actual words, and I thought that I was not able to talk about this traumatic experience. Even I was not able to tell the story. But meeting people that had the same experience gave me the language of
the language that you were looking for.
Yeah, I was looking for.
And unlike this morning when we were talking with Amelia about the places, I think that you started right away, because you lived for a long time in Rome, you started right away to speak about Rome, to write about Rome. So evidently space for you has a very important part in your writing. Can you tell us more about what Rome has, and what kind of meaning Rome has for you?
Yes, so Rome, I think that I wrote many of the short stories, and also Madre Piccola, the novel, many of the characters live in Rome. But I think that the first story that I wrote, short story that I wrote that is based in Rome, is Puntra, Rapdi Punti in Italian, and it is about a young girl who we don't know. She's African. She could be Eritrean, Somali. It's not specified, and she lives in the city, and somehow this was, I think, my first attempt, and then I tried to do it again with the second novel, to investigate how mythological, tales, dialogue with everyday life, with the surrounding realities, and somehow, for example, in the Comandante del Fiume is inspired to a Somali legend about the creation of the two Somali rivers. But the Fiume, the river of the novel, is the Tiber River in Rome. So somehow redefining the geography of the city through other stories. I try to imagine how our imagination, the tales that we were told, somehow give us another map of the city. Yes.
Well, in a way, space as memory can always be the story, or your story personal, is universal, and so it can be placed in many different spaces. So
yes.
For you, the space of Somalia is now transmigrated into the space of the city of Rome. And you were talking about very eloquently about the fact that you did your schooling in Italian and you write in Italian.
Yes.
So can you tell us how you could combine your culture, so the culture of oral tradition,
mm-hmm.
with then a language that you have internalized and made yours, and then create a narrative voice out of it? So can you tell us a little more how you, how important and what importance Italian has for you?
Yeah, so Italian is my mother tongue, so it's the language of my mother in reality, and but it was not the language of the everyday life. So it was very interesting because at the beginning, when I arrived in Italy, I often used words that were not common, were not, used in the oral vocabulary. And because I didn't grow up with TV, didn't grow up speaking Italian every day with people of my age. There were no dialects in Mogadishu. Everyone had his own accent, perhaps in Italian. And then I suddenly, when I arrived, when I started writing, I felt this urgency to delve into the Somali oral culture, not to be nostalgic, but even because I was looking for answers. So I thought that literature is a very powerful tool, because to question reality, because reality is never is vague, is never definite. So as I think that all people who write, who are artists, have to start with questions. You start to write because you are answering. You are trying. Your writing is an attempt to find an answer, and which is never definite. It's always open, an open answer.
And in fact, actually, it's very interesting because one of the protagonists of Little Mother, Madre Piccola, has two names.
Yes, she also has
Domenica Axel.
Yes.
So can you tell us why did you choose to name one of the protagonists with double name?
Yeah, it's Ahado is also in Somali, is in Arabic as well, is the Sunday, come Domenica. But the roots of the word are wahid. It means in Arabic means one. So she starts telling in the prelude, telling her story by saying Somali bang Somali, I am Somali. So everybody was asking, because this is a very nationalistic song that was written in the 60s after independence. And so people were saying, oh, you are claiming that you are Somali. What about this? No, this character is claiming that she's Somali. But I was saying, for that period of time, a historical period in Somalia, saying I'm Somali means I'm free. It didn't mean I'm Somali against you. Again, it didn't mean to claim a nationality. It means to say I'm proud of what I am because I'm free. I'm not colonized anymore, and so on. So she says, come la mia amica Somali bana, I like my. Yeah.
Yes. Sorry. There's a little bit of introduction.
Yes, she says, there is a. Somali, like my half that is whole. And so she's. It is not a half. It's something that it's a whole. Yes, it's complete. Yeah.
And so you wrote 2 novels, Madre Piccola, Little Mother, and Il Comandante del Fiume, the captain of the river. But let's focus first on Little Mother. And the narrative interlaces the conversations of 3 major protagonists, Barney, Domenica Aksa, and her partner, Peggy Reed. The motif of the narrative is that of a broken, and I quote, necklace whose pearls have been strewn all over the world, but also that of a tangled net of stories, destinies, and trajectories of a scattered community. And what were your hopes in developing such a choral narrative? Because this is really something very characteristic of your first novel.
Yes. So what I was saying about the question, I was asking myself, how an individual who has lost all his references, points of references, start to live again in a new place. And I think that the answer that they find the answer to this question through relationships. So these characters do not only speak, each of them speaks 3 times, but it's not only that they don't speak to the reader, but they speak to somebody. So which is every time different. Is one time is close and one time is distant in the sense that it's not of it doesn't belong to the community of the character. So, for example, Barney speaks once with a journalist talking about the Somali community, and the other time she talks with her cousin, as Domenica had. So Domenica, she has a very intimate relationship with Domenica, but the journalist is somebody that she doesn't know. So it's not a linear narrative. You just I wanted the reader to feel lost, as people of the diaspora feel lost, and to try to reconstruct all the threads of this story, making an effort, actually, yeah. And sometimes people say, "Oh, with all these names, we get lost," and they say, "This was my purpose. I wanted people to get lost in the narrative."
Yeah, that's actually what one notices when one reads Little Mother, because you have spread these relationships over time and space.
Yes.
So it really is confusing, meaning you deny the possibility of a linear understanding of the story of your community. So that's very interesting, something that I noticed still. So did you do that on purpose?
Yes, and because I think that it's not only the stories. I mean, in the structure of the novel you are telling us, the structure itself is a message. I think that it's the most, even perhaps the stronger, by the construction that you decide for a novel is, it's.
Tells a lot about what you want to do.
What you want to do. Yes.
You want to displace us too.
Yes.
But also in the narrative there is very much the talk and the element of borders and of bodies hitting or arriving at the border and having problems and anxieties and accidents at borders. So how important is the idea of this element that you place in your narrative, the borders? Because I mean, in the narrative style, you create relationships that cross borders.
Yes.
But then the bodies actually are stopped at the border. So there's a different, or there's an incongruity there. There's a change of pace.
Yes, yeah. In fact, the first chapter in Barney's narrative, I think that she's the most political character of the novel, and she is the one who tells the story of the 13 Somalis dead bodies that arrived on the Italian shores, and this funeral is very important. I mean, it was very eloquent, because she's asking, we are doing all this funeral, this main ceremony for people who are dead, what we are doing for people who are alive, who arrived alive. And I think that experience was a real one, and I put it in the book. But and it's all everything is the border is always mentioned, because even when people there are stories about people leaving Somalia, there is always the sea, always these two elements, the water with the border in itself, and the fire. Yes, and so
it's very important.
Yes.
Yes. And then also, what really struck me in your narrative is that the series of monologues. It's a series of monologues that are intended to be a dialogue, but I mean there is no dialogical possibility, because the person talks to somebody who is really not responding. But you talk a lot. All of these protagonists talk as if they were confessing something, as if they were talking about parts of their culture that are not necessarily revealed. And in many parts, in many passages, the protagonists really criticize their culture. This is really interesting, because generally in the first narratives of migration that we have in Italy, it was more a nostalgic view of the community from which the protagonists came. But in your case, the protagonists are all very objective, painfully objective about the describing or about their community, the way they describe the inconsistencies and the conflicts in their community. So there's no nostalgic consolation.
Yes, but because I think that the situation, Somalia, the political situation of Somalia is still is not still the same. But I mean, we have this kind of there is this problem that it's not we didn't have a reconciliation actually. So people in the diaspora you see in the same cities, and in the Comandante I wrote it very clearly, but there is something that was not spoken. It's as unspeakable. I mean, there is still a civil war, and as Nuruddin Farah says, that when something happens, when in Somalia rains, there is an umbrella opening in all the countries of the diaspora. So we have the repercussions of what happens in Somalia elsewhere, and so, for example, I mean, it's something that it's very powerful, because the first time I went to London, there is this street where you have two Somali restaurants. They have almost the same name, and I was asking my father why we always go there and we don't go there, and he was never answering, and he would say, okay, no, because he's my friend. Oh,
No, it's just a technical question.
The owner is a friend of mine, so I don't. But in the reality, and nobody tells you, but everyone knows where to go and why, because the hatred was so powerful that people don't speak with each other. They haven't spoken yet. So, but nobody says that clearly. I mean, and. So I thought that it was very important, and I think that here in Madre Piccola there is a story where Barney, who is the most rational character, she has this kind of she's not disgusted. She's uncomfortable when she meets this woman on the street, because she assumes that this woman must be of
of another clan.
Another clan, but she's even not able to say that. So she feels uncomfortable, and she starts imagining why this woman is wearing golden earrings, and she assumes that she received these earrings from somebody who looted her house, and so it is all so complicated, and it is very important to talk about that.
Yeah, I think that was very courageous of you, because it's very difficult to be so painstakingly critical of your community and of the situation. But I would like to invite some students who may have read the novel to add questions or to think of questions while I ask one question that is interesting. Or yes, a question about short stories. Yeah, of the short stories. So think about it, and I'm going to ask a question that I noticed that all the protagonists have a name.
Oh yes.
Except the mother, the Italian mother. The Italian mother's name is never mentioned. So I think that there must be some reason why.
Oh, that's interesting, because I never realized that she didn't have a name.
Oops. Oops. But Barney, Taggery, and
yes,
Domenica,
everybody, even the father.
You gave Domenica 2 names and the Italian mother no name.
Yeah, she doesn't have a name. It's true. Maybe because Italy somehow it was not. It is not that it's for the, how can I say, it was not focused on this mother. She's almost absent in the narrative. I mean, she's something that distance, perhaps no. It's something. She's somebody who through which I think Domenica had feels
Marginalized?
Not marginalized, but I can't find it. Estraniata, perhaps, dalla sua stessa.
She's estranged
yes.
from her own mother, Domenica.
Yes, somehow, and she's not able to deal with her own story, Somali part, for many years. So somehow, her mother is not part of her story, because she's not there when she
so she's not really, she's a marginal character.
Yes.
She's not important for the plot.
Yes,
I mean,
she's not so important for the plot, perhaps. Yeah.
This is something to further investigate.
Yes.
But also, and you mentioned Somali Van Ahai, am I pronouncing? I am a Somali, is a recurrent refrain in the introductory chapter.
Yes.
But as the story goes along, continues, there is no more of this chant or this recognition, I am Somali, I am free. So what happens to that subjectivity?
So I think that there are three the prelude, the interlude, and the ending. I choose these three songs that are connected with a particular historical moment. So Somaliland is the independence, is the golden age, I mean, of the nation, where everybody were optimistic and were hoping or waiting for a bright future for the country. And then we have the interlude with this song, Hammer wal Humay, Hammer, you have been violated, you have been ruined, and which is the civil war, and the ending is the song of the diaspora. And as I told you, my formal education was in Italian, so it was somehow also a tribute that I made to the Somali literature, mingling together these two literary traditions. I thought that it was somehow important also to put these songs in an Italian book. Yeah.
I'm open to have questions from the students. Anybody would like to?
So for my upper-level Italian class, we also we read Giammatteo Identità, and she talks about her struggle with balancing her identity as an Italian and a Somali woman. I was wondering if you could talk about, you mentioned a little bit more how you, especially because you said Italian was such a big part of your life growing up in Somalia, how you had if you struggled with your experience forming your own identity as both a Somali and Italian woman.
Yeah. Thank you. So I think that, as I said, it's the more, because I grew up in this household where the two parts were together, were very intimately together. So often, when in Italy people talk about second generation, I don't like this expression, but people who have different origins and who grow up in Italy, you have this kind of gap, this border as between what the house is, your home, and the outside world. And for me, it was something, that growing up, seeing that my mother and my father, we say the same thing, naming it differently, was something that it was a sort of early workshop for me, because you understand that you can perceive reality in the same way, but naming it with different words. So it is not easy at all. So, but and also I always say that my mother has never learned Somali very well, and so I have always been her translator when I was in Somalia, and it was somehow it was a very powerful experience, because I think that that translation to translate means also to convey emotions, and especially when you are very young, and you are translating for adults. You have to somehow to filter with this emotion, and also culturally, and yeah.
To piggyback a little bit on the idea of identity, I am reminded of many female writers of the second generation,
Yes.
Which is really not an appropriate terminology, but in their search for an identity, they hurt their body.
Yes.
They hurt their body through bulimia or what is the other one? Bulimia and anorexia, or through actually scaring their body with which is something that actually happens in the Comandante del Fiume.
In Domenica?
No, in Comandante del Fiume there is a character that.
No, it is Domenica.
So Domenica does, this
Yes.
careful carving of her body, but at the same time, in the novel, one of the reflections that Domenica makes is that how different is the understanding of the body in Somali culture and in Italian culture.
Yes.
So that seemed like a very important difference that she recognizes in this, in her displacement. So can you tell us
Yes.
about?
Yeah. So many people ask me about the self-harming act of Domenica, but when I didn't felt as if she was doing self-harming acts, because she's the only one who writes. I mean, the book the novel is written, but all the characters are telling their story, whereas Domenica is the only one who writes a letter to her psychologist, and he writes in a very formal way, and using very formal words, and actually she writes on her body. It's like she's confused, and so by writing on her body, she feels as if she's making a statement. I'm here, and my body is here, and I'm writing on my body. But I know that people perceive it as something that she's doing. She's self-harming. But yeah, and what was the
For her, there it is then some kind of narration. She's
Yes.
narrating her story through
her body, and yes, writing on her body. And she's the one. And at one point also she has sometimes she's unable to talk. She's aphasia. We say that in English. Aphasia. And so she writes. She's not able because writing is something that makes her feel rooted to the ground and to feel to feel more, that she's more herself. Yeah.
That she's present.
She's present in this world, in this moment, somehow.
We're going to say these other questions.
Thank you. Cristina, for Anilda, writing is a political action, un'azione politica. Is the same for you? What's the final goal of your writing?
Yes. So I think that writing is somehow all we do is political in a way. I mean, even though you need to be very careful when you write with I mean all the artistic forms to not to get straightforward to the message. I mean, everybody can read the message through what you do, but I mean, I don't like literature when it is too much straightforward, when the message is on your face. I mean, and I think that yes, it may be it is political, and because also I mean I am also a political subject, because people often, I mean, when I arrived in Italy, people didn't know anything about Somalia, so they would ask me every time why I speak so well Italian, and I would respond, Italian is my mother tongue. And why is your mother tongue? I didn't have the answer. I was born here, but I grew up somewhere else. But because Somalia was colonized by Italy, and nobody knew that, and so by writing, I think that my aim also is to mingle together these two stories, and sometimes I also use words in Somali because there is this relation of power between languages. So you have the language of the colonizer get into the language of the colonized. Often it's not sometimes the opposite as well happens. But here I put some Somali Somali variation of Italian words into the book, so to suggest that this kind of relation of power can be subverted by putting the words, the Somali word, the Italian words, changed by Somali. That this kind of relationship between language, between power, can be absolutely yes, can be yes.
And sorry,
You can talk.
No.
So I think that this is a question for both Anilda and Cristina, because you both come from areas that were colonized by Italy, right? In a different way. Somalia, much longer, remained an Italian protectorate until 1960, and Albania was invaded by Italians and then gained a lot. The narratives by both Albanians and Somalis about colonization, they both come from male writers. Nuruddin Farah in the case of Somalia, and Ismail Kadare on the part of Albania, because we have Il Comandante dell'Armata Morta, the commanders. So we have some female voices narrating Italian colonialism, but can you tell me if you have any desire to go in that direction, to talk back to male narratives about colonialism? I mean, we have one novel practically about Italian colonialism in Ethiopia, which is Tempo di Uccidere. No, yes. Sorry, in Ethiopia. Yes, in Ethiopia.
Yes.
We practically have zilch about Libya. So can we talk a little bit about talking for women who were colonized by the Italian, about whom very little has been told, and they have suffered considerably, you know, through Madanismo and all of those practices.
Yes. Thank you, Graziella. So perhaps I'm anticipating something that Simona wanted to ask me. So now, because now I'm working on a novel which is set in the period of the Italian trustship in Somalia, so the AFIS in Italian, Amministrazione Fiduciaria Italiana. And I was particularly interested in this period because I did a research on Somali theater at the period, and people, I mean, the theater was a tool that Somalis used for the independence fights, and the poetry was the higher form of communication of art, but then through the theater they were able to reach other parts of the urban city, the citizen, the population of the cities, and there was this movement, La Lega dei Giovani the Somali Youth League, and they were all males, and there were some women who were participating in their activities. But it is very interesting because when you read the story, the women had not only to fight against the colonialism, but even against the discrimination of the male colleagues. So I think that this is very complicated because it was also the time when women they were trying to liberate themselves, to have voice, to be political subjects. So I think that this perspective is very interesting because it's not only if you want to colonialism to fight against colonialism and patriarchy. It's very complicated. You can do both, but so I'm trying to investigate this narrative through the eye of the women of the period.
Rubarti pure la scena, come mi piace tanto questa cosa, che devo parlare durante il suo però sarò brevissima perché ci tengo che lei è la protagonista. Allora, sono due contesti storici molto diversi, perché intanto l'occupazione albanese dura molto poco, 39 e 43 che arriva il nazismo.
So she's saying that the historical contexts are quite different because the Italian occupation of Albania was very brief.
4 years.
For 4 years, so quite a different situation from Somalia.
Quindi è molto poco per chiamare, sicuramente c'ha un nome quello di occupazione, però non sono una vera colonizzazione, almeno nel quotidiano delle persone, la prima cosa. E la seconda è che subito dopo la guerra in Albania viene la dittatura, quindi non c'è più tempo per raccontare, perché si racconta l'uomo nuovo, nasce il realismo socialista, che diventa indifferente ciò che è accaduto con gli italiani, perché tu sei occupato a raccontare l'uomo nuovo che sta nascendo nella dittatura del proletariato.
So and immediately after that 4-year occupation, communism, the sort of communist dictatorship began. Occupied as it became with their own narratives about the new man and so forth, and that in some senses erased or prevented any kind of processing of that 4-year occupation.
E poi, per tornare al discorso femminile e maschile, oltre Ismail Kadare non dimentichiamo comunque che appartiene anche al realismo socialista, tutto sommato. Se andiamo a vedere oggigiorno le narrative, ciò che si narra si ricostruisce un po' come se fosse un lavoro artigianale, quel passato. In assoluto sono 4 scrittrici albanesi, sono Ornella Vorpsi, Elvira Domes, Besa Miftiu, che pubblica con una delle case più grandi editrici, Gallimard, se non mi sbaglio, e io che pubblico con Einaudi. Quindi se vai a vedere, tutte e 4 abbiamo fatto nel nostro piccolo, ricostruendo nel dopoguerra, sono 4 narrative femminili, nessun uomo. Ismail Kadare lo lasciamo da parte perché appartiene a un'altra generazione, è un'altra cosa. Quindi...
Sì, ma parlavo proprio della
Aspetta,
narrazione.
She said that although yes, it's true that Kadare is sort of the first sort of transnational, let's call him, male author from Albania. Nonetheless, the reality is that there are 4 women, strong sort of women writers
And
who
they are
have
Ornella Vorpsi, she mentioned.
who are Vorpsi,
Donis, Ibrahimi, and then Besam Muftiu, who publishes with
who
Gallimard.
have been in fact processing that history, at least as.
Ok, parla Cristina.
So, I think that actually there's a lot of political. I think that what happened? I think there's a lot of political discourse in the framework of these monologues, actually also in Little Mother. But I believe that probably the first discourse that you have to do is against patriarchy.
Yes.
You know, in your context, you know, rather than. I don't know how you can do it. I'm sure that as a great writer that you are, you will be able to to conflate the discourse of patriarchy with the discourse of colonialism in the future, which you're doing actually already. Yes. But I felt that actually maybe the most important political discourse is that against patriarchy in your culture. Little Mother, there's a strong presence of childhood, and also in all this discourse of loss, displacement, there are also glimpses of hope that you connect with the birth of a new child. Can you tell us about that?
Yes.
And then we talk about the Comandante.
The Comandante, on the one hand, is childhood is not compared, but it corresponds to the childhood of the nation when there was this optimistic feeling of the future, and the childhood memories and the birth, because the title in itself is Little Mother, is the Habariyar in Somali, which means the aunt, the sister of the mother. And so motherhood is intended in the book not as a biological experience, but more as because women in the diaspora are the ones who take the responsibility for the kids, for the future, who in face of all this distraction, they are the ones who try to keep together all the pieces, all the kids, all the and somehow to the child.
But it's important for you to have a glimpse of hope.
Yes.
At the very end, where there's a newborn baby, there's a newborn life.
There is a newborn life, and his name is Tariq, which means history in Arabic and Somali. That was the same name of one of the characters' father. So it's like that story is lost, has been lost in the Civil War. And now we have another story too, that it's just born, and I love happy endings somehow, so
Yeah.
I'm always.
But actually, to me, in a novel that is entitled Little Mother, and where there is a strong presence of female characters, I couldn't. I had to recognize that there is a sense of the necessity of a male.
Yes.
I mean, there's always like this looking for the father, looking for this absence,
Yes.
which is also present in Comandante del Fiume. So in 2007 you published Little Mother, in 2014 with a hiatus of 7 years you
Yes.
published Comandante del Fiume, and this is a little bit of, it's very different. as narrative
Yes.
from the first one, because it has only one person narrating the story, and he is an adolescent. So can you tell us about him?
Yes.
And can you tell us about his first name? Because I have actually
Yeah,
chopped
but-
all your names in Somali.
No.
So.
Yes, Yabar is a 18 years old boy who grows up in Rome, and his parents. I mean, we don't know many things about his father, but he's Somali. He was born in Somalia, and you're right. Symbolically, is a sequel to the first novel, because the first novel ends with the birth of Tariq, and the second novel is about this. And here again, I wanted just to, because family, I think blood relationship with Somalia was so awful for the history that I thought that this is a family who is not related to. In Comandante di Fiume, we have two friends. We choose to live together and raise their children together. So again, they choose to have this new family, which is not linked to. I mean, they don't have blood relations, and again, it's always again this kind of contesting the patriarchal family, where you have the father, the mother, and you have to follow your the Tami. How can I say? The
clan, maybe.
The clan, and you belong to that.
The bloodline.
The bloodline, yes. And he's the one who is telling the story. Yeah, but actually he's the only voice. Whereas in Madre Piccola we have three characters.
I have to use this. And it is a sort of Bildungsroman. It's a novel of formation. And you mentioned that there are two women who raise two children, a boy and a girl, because the girl is Sissi. And essentially they do come from two different clans.
We don't know that. I
You
didn't
don't
say
know?
that.
Okay.
No.
But it seems like because there is no blood relation,
Yes.
there is no direct line. So in a way, you are starting to attack, to criticize that idea that you form a family only if you come from the same family, clan or history. And it seems to me that they were also very different, Sissi and Yabar. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
So she's. He considers Sissi his sister, and she's the daughter of his mother friend, and he calls also the mother friend auntie, and Zia Rosa. And this girl is. Sissi is 1/4 Somali, but she doesn't look. She's white. But she claimed to be Somali. She claims this in her identity. She's a little bit, she mythologized a little bit Somali story, whereas Yabar is black, because both his parents were black, and so they love each other very much, but they always have these discussions about color and about identity, because apparently Yabar is he doesn't want to be pigeonholed. Yes, he refused all these kind of connotations and so on. But on the contrary, Sissi loves Somali stories. Somehow she also exoticizes this kind of, and which is something happens very often in kids who have other origins. They tend to sometimes to orientalize their own identity. Yes, right.
And what struck me about Yabar is that he's restless. He is looking for, is fighting or struggling to belong somewhere, but not to belong to, as you said, to just the connoted universe to which people are trying to push into and to pigeonhole him into. So it's a struggle for identity, for belonging, and it is something that is connected very much with the absent father.
Yes. Yes. Yes, it's about he's looking. It's like and he's looking for his father. Actually, he's looking, and I think that in Comandante del Fiume was very important for me. The idea of how the stories that the history that preceded the character, very often what it's called post memory. The memory of the previous generation, it's often is perceived as real from the people of the new generation, even if they didn't experience that, because how trauma is passed, even if we don't live the trauma. So this kid, I mean, he was born in Somalia, but he doesn't know anything about the civil war. But nevertheless, these memories were transmitted to him, and I found this kind of several things that were related to the Holocaust memories, because often people who are the children of the Holocaust, even though they have not memories on their own, they have these memories because they were passed to them, even not in a narrative way, but through the body, through some kind of silences. And Jaber does this because his mother refuses to tell him the actual story, what really happened to his father, but he knows that. And at the end, he says, I had always known where my father was, but I didn't want to know it and to know.
Well, actually, it's very. What you don't want to know is the truth.
Yes.
And the mother always refuses to tell him the truth, and he seeks this truth, knowing that he could destroy him.
Yes.
Because the truth is never really the mythologized truth that you have about your father in particular. So there is a beautiful page where Jaber remembers a moment in time when he was a child and his father appeared out of nowhere. And they were in a summer camp, and the father and the boy take a picture, or take a series of pictures in some of those camera booths where you have like the photo booths where you have like 4 pictures and they were all different. And then later on in life he tries to cut the pieces and put them together, and what comes out of the father's figure, the father's image, is a monstrous image. So that's very metaphorical of this kind of attempt that is never successful, and then in the attempt to piece together the story,
Yes.
a monstrosity comes out.
Yes.
Do you want to add anything?
Yes, it's also about this story about about the goodness and the evil. In order to live with, to find the goodness, you have to learn to live alongside.
To govern.
To govern the evil. Yes, it's and so he doesn't know who this Comandante del Fiume, who is able to control not the sharks, the crocodiles is, and because in Somali we use the same word to say crocodiles and sharks. Pesce cane, and yes, and so it is metaphorical, and at the same time it's also historical. I mean, to the outside world, but he has also to control his anger. He's always angry, and so on. Yeah.
And do we want to reveal the ending where at the beginning he says, well, there is a Somali oral tale that talks about this Comandante del Fiume, the captain of the river, who is able to sail the river, mindful that the river is full of crocodiles, and he's able to govern the evil that the crocodiles represent. And at the beginning he thinks it's his father, but then at the end he realizes that it is himself. So it's the story of self-search that ends in success, because at the end, also through an illness to the eyes,
Yes.
he's finally able to see
Yes.
what's happening and how he has to look towards the future. But I want to ask if there are any other questions.
More than one question. Is this story dedicated to your son, who left for Canada? Then how your stories are received in Somalia, if you brought them back? And the last one, if you talk to your mother about your writing, what does she say? This is kind of intimate.
Very intimate questions. So I think that, for example, for Madre Piccola, there were two very important sources. I already mentioned the Somali songs, then there were very long telephone conversation that I would do with all the people of my friends, with people all around the world. We would speak every day, and what I realized was that it was very beautiful because even though we were very far away from each other, what makes a relationship feel always yes, is that you speak about the everyday life. You speak about what you were preparing, maybe that you went, not very extraordinary things. So these were the stories that I would listen from the people, and also some interviews that I did in Rome. So I always use this kind of oral history thing, the interviews and a conversation. And the Comandante del Fiume, of course, was inspired because as I was seeing my son who was growing up in Rome, but also through the stories that he would tell me every day. But also there is a very important, very long part, very strong part in the book, which is what inspired me to write the book, which is that when I met, I was working as a mediatore culturale, cultural mediator at the time, and I was working with a man who was younger than me, whose name was Romano, and he was from Ethiopia, and he grew up in Rome, and he would speak with a very strong Roman accent, and so I told him I want to do this book. I want to talk about people who grew up and were black, but it was many years ago, you see, so nobody had at the time was talking about it, and so putting together all these narratives, I think that they helped me to write the book. The second one was because
How it's received in Somalia, your book?
Okay, in Somalia, unfortunately, people can read the book only in English. So I was very happy when it was published in English, because Somali was written in the 72, the Somali language, and we don't have, there is not a tradition, come si dice? Tradizione di romanzo. It's only poetry, novelists or short stories, not narrative. It's mainly poetry, and so it was very interesting because an uncle told me, "Oh, you know, this book is so much, it's so Somali. Are you sure that Italian will understand that?" Because I was like, "Oh." And my mother, it's very complicated for her to see because she cannot realize that it is fiction. So sometimes she feels like, I say, it's not me.
This is really a question not just for you, Christina, but also for Anita, which is, are you conscious of yourselves as playing some kind of leadership role in expanding an Italian literary establishment which has not always been known for its openness and flexibility?
I think that it's still very difficult. I mean, there was sometimes they because there is this thing that people say in Italy that we don't have no more. People are not able to tell stories anymore, and so the story that the audience is interested in are stories of migration because they are stories. But at the same time, I feel I don't think that. I mean, in the 90s, it was these books were not considered as literary books, but now thing has changed. But at the same time, I think that the publishing industry is. But I think that in U.S. it may be similar, but it's not so much interested. It's not so much investing in this kind of narrations. And I think that's interesting enough. We are Anilda, and there are no new generation that are writing. And it is not because there are not people who are writing, but because the publishing industry is so complicated. So sometimes we have bloggers, but there is not an investment that enable these people to write something that is longer. So I think that there may be other writers, young writers, but they are not emerging, and it tells something about how the situation in Italy is.
Well, we were thinking that maybe Cristina can read some passages from her book. Because we have reached, we have only 5 more minutes.
Oh, no.
Is there any, I think that she didn't, did you
You
want to
don't
answer?
want
I'm
to?
sorry, because you
Yes,
you
answer. Perché non puoi parlare?
Condivido.
okay. Anida shares the opinion of Cristina.
Yeah, perhaps I just wanted to ask you, you moved to Belgium 6 years ago.
Yes.
How this new migration has impacted your life, experience, ways of writing? Because of course, I mean, we always talk about Italy, Somalia, but now there is this other culture, identity, language, etc., which is part of your experience. So perhaps you
Thank you, Simon. No, that's a very important question for me, because I think that somehow when I moved to Belgium, I was writing Il Comandante, but I had already done all the research to write a book, and so I didn't need to do any kind of research. But then, as if it's because these 2 novels and all my writing is mainly based on these oral interviews and discussion and conversations. I felt there was a point where I felt that I was not able to write in the same way. And in fact, the last 2 things I have worked on were rewriting of the Antigone for theater in Palermo, and then I worked on a libretto of an opera that will be performed in Matera, and these have nothing to do with my own. They have to do, of course, because this is me who is writing, but they have nothing to do with Somalia. They have nothing to do with Italy, and it was very interesting for me because I was working with books, with readings, but not with oral histories anymore. And I think that also in I wrote some short stories that doing research in the archives, and you see that the language is completely different from the Madre Piccola language and from the previous ones, and because it takes time to get used to a place, to learn the language, I think, and I hope I answered your question.
So your next novel is in Flemish. I think that we don't have the time to read a passage from a small passage. No, dai. That's Italian. No, dai. Come on.
I don't know because I will try to.
Yes.
Okay.
I will hold it there.
Yeah. So it's I'm reading. I will no. So
I'll hold it. We were thinking of reading the interlude.
Yeah.
5, number 5.
Yes, it's number. E dopo di questo sì. Proprio 2 righe.
2 lines.
Yes, okay. So just couple of words about the interlude. It's interesting because it is in the middle of the book, but it was the first part that I wrote of the novel, and I hardly changed it. I rewrote many parts of the book, often, but not this one. Hammer is the name of Mogadishu in Somalia. Hammer shrouded in silence. You think that the most terrifying thing is to hear noise, shots, mortal fire, agonizing screams. Instead, you look straight ahead into that hole down there in the corner of your room, and you hear nothing. Priming rules. Even if there is something around you, you feel like a naked body that's burning in that noise that is not there. The noise that is not there is about to materialize, and perhaps it will get you first.
Thank you very much, Christina. Thank you so much. And I think it's always difficult to reveal oneself to an audience, so I really appreciate and your patience also in responding to, in answering all the questions. So thank you so much. And I think that we have 15 minutes of break, and then we will have the presentation by Graziella Baracchi.
Okay. No, put them here.